I've been asked by Richard to talk about classical directions, primary directions. This is a very old system for Western astrology. It is rather mathematically complicated, which is why a lot of practitioners prefer secondary directions, which are a logical arithmetical extension of primary directions. And they are qualitatively a bit different. The important thing to remember is in whatever system you use, the lines are blurred between internal events, feelings, and external events. I always like to say that character is destiny. It's how we feel that usually determines the outcome. I know that Heindel didn't always present that way. He was of the opinion, his personal opinion, that fixed signs, especially on the angles where planets are most strong, tend to be fated, in the sense that an acorn is fated to become an oak tree in the Hellenistic sense. But for most of us, that line between internal and external is blurred. But always, you want to focus on the nativity, because nothing that is not promised in the nativity or birth chart can manifest through some transit, primary direction, secondary direction, etc. To complicate this further, just like with secondary progressions, there's more than one way to not only delineate or interpret, but there's more than one way to calculate. In my experience, I'm not a professional, but I've been doing this for a long time. I find validity in most of the methods. Some are just easier to use because, like medicine, astrology is an art as well as a science. And one particular method might be more consonant with the interpreter's personality and perception. Heindel did say that primary directions are focused on the desire world. So they're more abstract and more distant than secondary. I like to use Ptolemy's primary directions. His method is simpler, and I will delineate this for you in 4 points. 4 things to keep in mind. Number 1 is 1 degree of equatorial arc moving in the chart equals 1 year of life. Like I said, there are different ways to calculate a chart by progression. Heindel taught one way. Some people like right ascension. Actually, that's what most astronomers use. Some people advance the midheaven. It's a little more complicated, and I don't want to get into trigonometry and calculus. I'm not a mathematics major anyway. But you want to use the latitude of the planets. That's the most important thing. Point number 2, planets conjunct angular house cusps are important. And I find this to be very true in any system. It's not just sign placement, that affects a planet's strength. But if you look at astrocartography, the whole basis of it, why it works so well, is that when planets are angular, close to the cardinal houses, in fact, strongest just a tiny bit west of the actual angle, using Placidus, they are at maximum potency, strength, to hinder or help. The weaker houses are the ones most removed from those. But actually, it's not just the house per se, but the area. So really, you want to look above the ascendant, all the way about halfway down, okay? Because by the time you are more than 50% through the ascendant, which might even be the next sign on the second house cusp, potency is diminishing. So aspects don't have their strength. Number 3, use the tropical zodiac, not the sidereal zodiac, and Placidus houses. That is what Ptolemy used. To complicate things further, there are many choices for house systems. In the oldest systems we have, there were no houses, there were only signs. But I find that Placidus, or topocentric, which is very close to Placidus, works best. There are times, if I'm looking at transits or secondary progressions, that I also like to use Campanus, which uses the prime vertical. Which really, if one looks at the mathematics of Heindel when he calculates a horoscope, is really what he's doing. And it's what Gary Westenberg uses in his publications for the fellowship. No planets conjunct planets, forget them. Stick with the basics. We don't even care much about interplanetary aspects. For now, at least, forget planets conjunct planets, like some astrologers have used for directions. Now, in the secondary charts, I use them, not in primary. Primary is, we want to make it simple. We're talking about something very ethereal, the desire world. This is a hotly debated topic, whereas one can use right ascension to determine primary directions to the MC and obliquity of ascension to determine primary conjunction to the ascendant. These won't work for interplanetary aspects like Mercury to Mars, for example. So you want to focus on planets conjunct angular house cusps, and you don't want to look at planet conjunct planet, or even really planets aspecting each other in the chart, not in the birth chart. Primary directions are one of the oldest predictive techniques in Western astrology. In many ways, they are like the dashas of Indian astrology, in that they identify periods during which certain planets involved tend to be active in the person's life. Although primary directions were widely used in classical and traditional astrology, they fell out of popularity in modern times because they were considered difficult to calculate in comparison with the more recent secondary progressions, which were introduced, by the way, by Placidus in the 17th century. Modern software programs have now made primaries more accessible, and they are regaining popularity. The other problem with the secondary progressions is, because the planets move so slowly, you really can't look at the outer planets forming aspects ever. They will not be partile. They won't be exact. Neptune will never be exact unless it was almost, within seconds of being exact in the birth chart to another planet. So that's a deficit with secondary. The basic premise of primary directions is that the manner in which the chart unfolds, due to the Earth's rotation in the first 6 hours after birth, correlates symbolically with how the native's life will develop during the first 90 years of life on this planet. Exactly why that is, in a scientific sense, I don't know. I couldn't explain it. But there's a law of correspondences at work that is amazing. And as you know, through Einsteinian relativity, time can be stretched. And that whole thing with black holes and the event horizon. It depends on your perspective, and it depends on your position and your movement. So time is not ultimate. In reality, there's probably just a now. But we are like the proverbial fly that's caught under the rag of a cleaner at a museum who is carefully running the cloth over a painting to dust it. Because there is duration, the fly deludes itself into thinking that it is not only participating, but creating the scenes that are going by, and then has a time frame, when in reality, the whole picture is already there. It just doesn't have the scope of perception to see it. But the past and the future are out there already in space. This is physics, not astrology. Also important are the years when there is a change of sign on the MC or ascendant, or for that matter, any of the house cusps, if you use quadrant houses, which is when you divide the chart into the 4 cardinal points: 10th, 4th, 1st, ascendant, 7th, descendant. And then you might divide them farther so that you get 12 houses. Not all systems do that. There's even a system that uses 8 houses. Finally, if you set up the chart to show the terms or bounds, you can see how the system of distribution unfolds over time as the bounds of the natal signs below the ascendant rise to the horizon during your lifetime. Remember, the signs go this way. Okay. The planets move in the other direction. Thank goodness for software, because if you're calculating this by hand and with logarithms, you have to be able to grasp calculus and major geometry, which for most people, it's good luck with that. Planets that closely aspect the directed ascendant, the ascendant in the primary chart, in a given year are quite significant. For most primary directions, I use an orb, a leeway, of influence of about 6 months before and after the direction becomes exact. Some mathematical facts for you. One sidereal day is 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds of ordinary clock time, which is 360 degrees on the equator. That's one rotation of the Earth. Dividing 23 hours, 56 minutes, and 4 seconds by 360 degrees in a circle gives a result of 3.989 minutes per equatorial degree, which is equivalent to 1 year of life in primary directions according to Ptolemy. This is where there's some debate and some disagreement, but he's one of the big names and one of the early fathers of Western astrology, and I like his method. But just for your intellectual curiosity, an alternative to Ptolemy's key for primary directions. If we symbolically equate one rotation of the Earth on its axis, a sidereal day, to 1 year of life, then dividing the length of the sidereal day, if you're interested, that's 23.934444 hours, by the number of days in a year, 365.24219, if you want to be technical, we get 3.931819596 minutes. So 93.181, 3.93 minutes crossing the MC, which is equivalent to 1 tropical year of life. So almost 4 minutes, but not quite. A sidereal day is used because it measures the time the Earth takes to rotate exactly once on its axis relative to the stars, and its duration is almost 4 minutes shorter than the solar day. Why? Because the Earth's orbital motion around the sun is a factor. This alternative approach follows the reasoning of 16th century astrologer Valentin Naibod. So if you want to do further research, that's Naibod. Valentin is his first name. That is not what Ptolemy uses, but it's very close. It only becomes slightly more significant as one gets older and older. The daily rotation of the Earth around its axis appearing to us as the rotation of the sky, complete with planets, stars, and the signs of the zodiac around our place of observation. So in approximately 24 hours, not only the sun, but every planet and every zodiacal degree will rise in the east, culminate in the south for an observer in the northern hemisphere, that is, set in the west, and finally travel unseen across its lowest point in the north, which is called the anti-culmination, below the horizon, to the place where it will then rise again. Some terms for you. What is right ascension? This is used by astronomers. Astronomers don't use zodiacal degrees to determine planetary positions. Right ascension is the distance of a point east of the first point of Aries. And how do they determine it? They measure it along the celestial equator, and it's expressed in hours and minutes. The method of primary directions can only be used with birth times accurate to within 1 minute. That's another reason why people often use transits or solar arcs, because otherwise the inaccuracies become paramount, and the prediction, is going to be off. A birth time inaccurate by only 1 minute would lead to any prediction being incorrect by a year. So effective use of primaries depends on a precise radix time. Radix simply means birth chart. This is also the reason that primaries are a powerful rectification tool. If you don't know or aren't sure when you're born, primary directions are a great way. You look at maybe 3 important events in a person's life, and then you expect to see a planet on an angle in the chart. Placidus is the most common method, and its model of ascension in my opinion, is the most accurate for this work. And that's what most programs use anyway in the West. In Europe, Coke, which really should be pronounced Koch, is becoming more and more popular. Like I said, technically, Placidus made a slight calculation error, and Topocentric corrects it, but you don't have to worry about that. Topocentric is, it's out there, but a lot of people don't have that option. Let's talk about Promisors and Significators. The kind of points, the type to direct promisors, and to which to direct are significators. The choices between planetary bodies with latitude, they're called mundo directions. Mundo, Earth in Latin, or between ecliptic intersects of point, zodiacal directions. The latter, zodiacal directions, is the more traditional method, but more and more modern astrologers who use primaries use the former method in mundo, which is also what Fagan used and Bradley used for their solar returns. I do find some validity in that, but let's make it simple. For this method, you want to use the zodiac. Let's talk about obliquity of ascension. As it rises, a star or a planet, not on the equator, forms an angle with that part of the equator, which happens to be rising at the same time. So it's kind of a link, like it's twin, positional twin. This is not normally used in natal astrology. It's in astrocartography, like where can I live to accentuate, let's say, Mercury. You would want it on an angle, but that's if your Mercury is well aspected. If it's badly aspected, you're going to accentuate and complicate its negative impact. So location does matter, especially in solar returns. So anyway, when a planet is rising and it's not on the equator, it forms an angle with a part of the equator that happens to be rising at the same time. It could also be a planet. This is called ascensional difference, AD. This AD is added to the right ascension, RA, if it has south declension, but you subtract it therefrom if it has north declension. This is all done on your computer if you have software, or go to astro.com. In terms of an example, and Richard will provide the chart for you, since I don't have that technical computer know-how or availability. Let's look at the chart of Robin Williams, the actor, who was born July the 21st, 1951 in Chicago at 1:35 p.m. CST. I'm using the Placidus semi-arc, which is my preferred method for directions. With Ptolemy's time key, 1 degree equals 1 year. Primary directed Mars square natal Pluto. So directed just means primary in the primary chart. Okay. His progressed Mars will be square natal Pluto exactly on the 11th of July, 2014. With the dynamic key of true solar equatorial arc of his birthday, which I had mentioned before, primary directed Mars square natal Pluto becomes exact on the 19th of August, 2014. So you can compare dates, right? There's overlap in that period anyway, but if something really significant and negative, because you're talking about a square between Mars and Pluto, happened, a fiery dynamic, and it was in July as opposed to around the 19th of August, then you can choose which method works better for you. Both of these dates perfect the primary Mars square Pluto, can be considered almost exact hits for the date of his demise. His demise was on the 11th of August, 2014. Why is this aspect so important? This aspect is significant because his ascendant, which is his life force or physical body, is in Scorpio, which is ruled by Mars and co-ruled by Pluto. Mars is the god of war and Pluto is the god of the underworld and the afterlife. The square of these two planets is often a symbol of a violent incident. I hope you have found this interesting and that the mathematics hasn't confused you, but like I said, if you remember the basics and you have software, it's not a problem. You can go ahead and do your research. But I tend to use secondary progressions if I don't have a lot of time, but when I want detail, I use all the systems. In fact, it's interesting to compare transits to the progressed chart, whether it be primary or even more importantly, secondary. And solar returns are helpful, especially if you use Campanus houses, I think. And I don't want to get far afield from the topic here, but in that case, I also like to use precession correction. So I use, it's not that I use the sidereal zodiac, but I correct the tropical positions. If you don't know what I'm talking about, that's a future lecture. That's another topic. But also I might mention that another topic is converse directions. You can actually work backwards instead of forward from the day of birth in an ephemeris for your directions. 1 year equaling, 1 day, 1 solar day, and see some interesting correlation between after your birthday and the same amount of time before your birthday. I happen to think converse directions, backward directions, are a little more fated. They seem to be. They have a little less to do with emotional expression or choices. So that concludes my lecture. I hope you enjoyed it. This is Rick signing off.